To put it into words, the fundamental recognition is just realizing there's no separate entity, or there's no doer. But really it's just not about, it's about not getting caught up in thought with all its concepts, because the concept of separation is only within thought. The concept of a me separate from life is only in thought. And that doesn't mean you can't think or thought can't be used, because it can. It just means seeing through the concepts of separation. I would say the shortest answer is to find a teacher that you resonate with, that you feel connection with, and be with that teacher. That's what I would genuinely say. Now, someone like me, I never had a teacher because I didn't resonate with teachers. I was too critical. I always found something wrong with them. And I'm also quite independent, so I would try to do everything by myself. So even that advice doesn't work for everyone. Be true to yourself. This is not about believing things. This is about seeing things for yourself. You can't really put this into words. It's too simple. It's too simple to be put into words. It's too immediate. It's too direct. The very putting it into words can itself be an obstacle. It can make it sound like there's an object called enlightenment that you've got to attain. Whereas what we're pointing at really is that you're already free. Do you hear that, guys? You're already free. That means that you don't actually have to get anything. You don't even actually have to know anything. You don't even have to even get any special understanding about reincarnation or life after death or psychic powers or anything. You don't have to know anything because it's already fully here. You don't have to do anything. Yeah. But having said that, understanding and doing things might be a part of your apparent journey in seeing this. Spiritual practices and inquiry and devotion can all be a part of it, and they were a big part of it for me. One practice I think I'll quickly share with you before I move on to some other questions is can be a really effective practice for some people. Again, if you kind of resonate with the practice. See, there's no one practice that resonates with everyone. What you tend to find is that A, B, and C might work for someone, but D, E, and F works for someone else. You know. So anyway, let me share with you this quite effective sadhana, quite effective spiritual practice, which is just to relax and be quiet. Allow yourself to settle down. And you can do this with me. Take a few deep breaths. And then come into contact with the sense of me. So, you know, you have a sense that I'm here. That for me, I'd use the word Tom. That, okay, there's Tom's here. And where is Tom? And I'd like to feel what Tom feels like. And maybe I've got a sense kind of here in my chest that here's the essence of Tom, or just behind the brow, maybe behind my eyes. This is where Tom is, and this is where the essence or center of Tom is. It's somewhere here. So really get a sense of, oh yeah, this is where Tom is. And then realize that whatever you're feeling is you, is me, is Tom or whatever. Obviously use your name, right? Realize that whatever you're feeling or seeing is something you're feeling, is something you're perceiving, therefore it's an object that appears to you. So it's an object, it's seen. So the fact that it's seen means that it's not the seer, it's not the one that sees. And in this way you could say that is not who I am, because that's an object that's appearing to me. Well, that's an object that's appearing in awareness. The purpose of the spiritual practice is to disidentify you with objects, especially the body-mind, and especially thoughts or the mind. So just come and notice any sense of self that arises and say, that sense of self is something that is known to me, therefore I am not it. And then allow yourself just to sort of sink into awareness. Well, you're meaning, sink into awareness, what does that mean? That just means you're not identifying yourself as being the body and mind. You're actually, what you're doing, you're identifying as awareness. In order to counteract the identification with the body and mind, it's a remedy. Because we're so identified, we're conditioned to identify as the body and mind, this practice is just doing the opposite. It's saying, stop identifying with the body and mind. Instead, let's identify with this thing called awareness, in order to counteract the false identification. And then when the job of the practice is done, you don't have to identify as awareness either. You can just let that go as well. And all there is what is. So that's a really nice practice. It can be very, very powerful if you resonate with it. The other very powerful method is surrender, especially if you believe in God, or if you don't believe in God, you can have the concept of the universe, and just to surrender to the universe and give thanks to the universe. It's such a powerful practice. It sounds too simple, sounds too good to be true. It sounds so simplistic that can't surely be it. But yeah, that can be a wonderful practice. The two, the gratitude practice, the surrender practice, and this self-inquiry type practice work really well together. One important teaching can be that any state of being or state of mind or state of consciousness that you achieve is a subtle object. It's an object that appears to you. So if you have an experience where everything feels really peaceful and really blissed out and wonderful, and I'm sure many of you have had experiences like that, whatever experience it is, maybe it's an experience of oneness, maybe it's an experience of timelessness, maybe it's an experience of peace. Whatever your experience, those experiences are known, aren't they? You are aware of them. If you're aware of it, that means it's an object that appears to you. It's a subtle object, meaning it's not something that you can perceive necessarily with the five senses, but it's an object nonetheless. And the golden rule about objects, again, you find this in all the traditions. The Buddha really stressed it. He said that everything comes and goes, or everything is intransient, everything is impermanent. It's all empty, meaning it doesn't have any enduring substance to it. What does it mean if I say it doesn't have any enduring substance to it? It means it will eventually go. It don't last forever. So if you're looking for a lasting peace, a lasting freedom, you won't find it in any subtle objects. Does the mind ever completely stop? It's a bizarre feeling. It's bizarre feeling a deep peace and then listening to the mental craziness. I'm sure many people can empathize with that, because especially if you're somebody who's able to access a deep peace in, say, meditation or something, and there can be a thought that, okay, all I've got to do now is prolong that. Yeah, prolong that sense of peace. But this isn't about attaining something, right? Because if you manage to prolong that sense of peace, you've then attained peace, which is that subtle object. Now, do you remember? I said it's a subtle object. It's something that's known to you. When you feel peaceful, that's an object that comes and goes. All objects, gross and subtle, come and go. They're all transient. They're all impermanent. Some stick around for a long time, but they will all eventually go. Does the mind ever completely stop? Well, it might completely stop, but your question implies that it stops forever. The thoughts carry on. The thoughts carry on. So in that sense, the mind never stops. Maybe at death, the mind stops. But I'm assuming you're talking about, do thoughts stop whilst you're alive? No. In fact, I was going to write a blog post on this. I haven't got around to it yet. Thoughts don't actually end. What happens is that the belief in a thinker ends. The belief in an entity, a separate entity, which is responsible for creating thoughts ends. And when that ends, it's like the mind's ended. It's like you've died. You haven't died, but it's like a form of death almost. And the thoughts then are kind of like they kind of have a different quality to them. And Robert Adams talks about this. Yeah, maybe I'll try and cobble a blog post together on this, and so you can see what Robert Adams says. But the mind doesn't actually end while you're alive. The thoughts continue, but the belief that there's a separate thinking entity, that's what ends. And that's why, and that belief in a separate entity is often called the ego, or the sense of I, or the sense of me. And sometimes it's called the mind being a synonym for ego. And so when that ends, it's like the mind's ended. So the Vedanta texts go into this in a lot of detail. And there's a particularly good text called Advaita Bodha Deepika. Let me see if I can write that down. Advaita, which you can download free from the internet as a PDF. I've just added it to the comments. I think it will appear in the feed. And it goes through exactly what it means. Again, you don't have to read that. It's a bit, you know, it's quite a technical text, but it explains most of Vedanta in a fair amount of detail. And it goes into this, especially in the last couple of chapters. And it was one of Ramana Maharishi's favorite books. So it's got a seal of approval from Ramana Maharishi. Again, if you're into that kind of type of teaching, then you might find it useful to read. And it will help you understand a lot when people say the mind ends, what that actually means. Yeah, it's a bizarre thing, a deep peace, and then listening to the mental craziness. That's the thing. These things are objects that appear within awareness. They're objects that appear to us. They're going to come and go. Peace is an object. Peace is an object. Shankara called peace the last obstacle to realization. As you progress along the spiritual path, you become more peaceful and you become more joyous and things feel better. But the liberation might not be there, even though things are better. And eventually we let go of even needing to feel good. Now, this is something you shouldn't force. You shouldn't force, because sometimes people need to go through a long period of feeling good. Especially if you've gone through a long period of feeling shitty for many years, then it can be very nice to go through a period of feeling good and having access to this bliss. And here I'd encourage you to follow your heart. So, does your heart say, actually, I need to dwell in this peace. I need to just be in this happy place, basically. Because that happy place, that peaceful feeling, if you can access it through meditation, through being quiet, through calming yourself down, that can heal. That's a very healing energy. It's like a spiritual shower. It cleans you, it purifies you. But you don't need to stay in the shower forever. You know, eventually when you're clean, you step out of the shower, and you don't need to be in that peace forever. But it has a place. Awareness simply is that which sees. I also find it quite useful to conceive of awareness as something that is just passively watching and doesn't do anything. Because I think that's quite useful. So I often say that awareness is not a doer. It doesn't do anything at all, it just watches. It doesn't think, it can't label, it can't choose. Thinking happens in the mind, labeling happens in the mind, choosing things happen in the mind. And awareness is aware of those activities, but doesn't do any of them. Just like the cinema screen analogy, in which the cinema screen doesn't do anything in the movie. It doesn't talk, it doesn't drive a car. That all happens within the dream or within the film. You got it? But awareness in itself doesn't do anything. It's the peace that surpasses all understanding. It's that which is always here watching. And it's at peace, meaning that it's never touched, it's never phased. It never experiences ups or downs, or it's always untouched. It doesn't move, it's always just the same. This is where the awareness teachings, as I call them, can be so useful, because no matter what's happening, awareness is always here. It's always aware. It's always fine. It's always constant. It's always unharmed and untouched. Just like the cinema screen is always unharmed and untouched by the movie. It doesn't matter if it's a violent film, or a love scene in the film, or just a boring part of the film. The movie, the screen is always absolutely fine. There are no problems for the screen. So there's always this part of us. There's always this part of us that is untouched by life. That's always whole and complete, always free. And that can be whether you're shitting yourself, whether you're having a panic attack, whether you're really scared, whether you're like really irate and frustrated. You see, all of that stuff, all that negative stuff is allowed. So this is why it's freedom from suffering. Because the suffering's there, but you're free from it. Yeah? And when you're free from it, it's not suffering, even though it is uncomfortable. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be comfortable. It's just natural. If you're in any discomfort, the body-mind will naturally try and correct that discomfort, because the discomfort's a signal from the body or from the mind telling us that something could be improved or something's going wrong. The perfection's already here, you know? Isn't that liberating? Even I know you might not feel, you may or may not feel that, and it might be, I don't feel it, I don't feel it. You don't have to feel it. And I know that might sound frustrating, but you don't have to feel anything. You don't have to realize anything. You don't have to have an experience. You don't have to have a realization. You don't have to have a wow moment. It's just too simple. It's too simple. It's too immediate. Isn't it wonderful? This is it, guys. This is it. It's freedom. The mind convinces us we're not free. I'm not free because of this. I'm not free because of that. You know, I don't know what awareness is. I'm not free. You are awareness. Awareness is here. Remember, don't cling to the words. See past the words. Any advice for someone who has slipped back into the mind and back into its suffering ways, but knowing at a deeper level that it isn't the real you? Okay. The mind comes and goes, meaning thinking comes and goes. Sometimes the awareness is, sometimes when the thoughts come, you can be in this kind of lovely, blissful, semi-detached state where the thoughts come and go like clouds in the sky and everything's hunky-dory because you're not attaching to those thoughts. And that feels fine because thoughts are there, they're kind of like breezing along, and that's cool. And you're kind of that which knows the thoughts, you're observing the thoughts, and you're grounded in the sense of you, and everything's fine there. And then the real world comes along, and maybe you've got a tough job, or something's happening in your life, a challenge, you know, you run into a challenge in your life, and the body-mind has to face that challenge, maybe. And in that moment, you get caught up in the mind, you're getting caught up in thinking. Your awareness, before it was on this spaciousness, your awareness was sort of hooked into this spaciousness, and the thoughts were allowed to come and go, and it was like, hey, everything's cool, dude. Yeah. and now it's like you just really zeroed into your thoughts. Like maybe you're trying to figure out the answer to a problem, and you're caught up in thought. Well, that's okay. You know, that happens. That's natural. That's a part of the natural functioning of the human being. When a challenge comes along, the body-mind has to meet that challenge, and it has to engage in thought. So it gets caught up in thought. If you're living in the everyday world, that's what happens. If you're a renunciate, if you're living in a forest, or you're a monk and you're on retreat or something, if you're at a satsang like this, or you're on a retreat with a spiritual teacher, then you're in an artificial situation, in the sense that you're not in your ordinary everyday life. So it's easy to feel blissed out and everything's coming and going. But when the point of what I'm sharing is the freedom in everyday life, and that's the freedom to actually get into your thoughts and get caught up in thoughts. You don't have to worry about getting caught up in thoughts. You don't have to worry about forgetting who you are. Did you know that? I'll say it again, you don't have to worry about forgetting who you are. You don't have to worry about getting caught up in thoughts. Why? Because you're never caught up in thoughts. Awareness is never caught up in thoughts. And awareness is always here, whether you know it or not. So it doesn't matter if you forget. Does that make sense? It doesn't matter if you forget. You don't see, what can happen is the seeker, the mind, the thoughts, the seeker says, enlightenment is when I know this, when I know that who I am all the time, and I never get caught up in thoughts. So what's happened there is the mind has created an idea of what enlightenment is. And again, you've created duality now between where you are and where the mind wants to get to. Whereas the reality is, this is where you are. And if where you are is caught up in thoughts and forgotten who you are, well, that's the perfection that's arising right now in the moment, and that's okay. Isn't that liberating? Isn't it liberating and freeing to know that whatever happens, it's okay? Wow, don't have to have a wow moment. Thank you, Tom. You're very welcome. Yeah, why do we put conditions? Why do we put conditions on enlightenment? Why do we say, oh, I'm not enlightened because I feel this way or feel that way? That doesn't matter. Why do we say I'm not enlightened because I get caught up in my thoughts or I don't know who I really am? You are who you really are, aren't you? And if you can see that there's a part of you that's never touched by life, what we can call awareness or consciousness or whatever, that's enough, isn't it? I've done an article that some people have said they found quite helpful called Roadmap to Enlightenment. So have a read of that on my website. Let me see if I can find it, and I'll post a link. And it talks about a spiritual map that I think is quite useful. It's quite practical, I think. And it's quite good, I think, in a modern context, because we have access to so many different types of teaching. It's posted at the bottom of the comments now. We've got access to so many different traditions and types of teaching that can be very confusing. So I've written that as a brief overview. Well, it's not that brief, but I could have written a lot more. So in that sense, it's brief. So have a look at that if you're interested. So in terms of spiritual bypassing essentially happens when you close yourself off to your emotions and your feelings. That's what I mean by spiritual bypassing. Maybe there's another way of looking at it. But it basically means when you convince yourself that you just avoid your feelings. And often it's people who are hooked into a very strong kind of conceptual teaching, often to do with consciousness or awareness. And this is one of the dangers in this kind of teaching about consciousness and awareness. You get trapped into these concepts. You say, I'm consciousness and my thoughts and feelings don't matter at all. That's true on one level. We shouldn't be overly worried about these things. But at the same time, if they don't matter, then you can feel them. The body, mind can just feel them totally, if it's right for that particular point in time, in that context. So what I mean by that is, if you're in work, maybe that's not the time to feel your emotions. Maybe you can wait till you get home from work, or if you're in the middle of a conference or something, you know. But essentially, not to avoid the way you feel, and to be true to yourself, to be brutally self-honest. If you allow yourself to feel, and intellectually you're honest with yourself, then you won't bypass. But you've got to be honest with yourself. You've got to be honest with yourself. And you've got to allow yourself to feel. You've got to be unafraid to feel and unafraid to think certain thoughts. And then you won't bypass because you're not trying to push anything away. In a way, there's no relation. You can say there's no relationship, because peace and love, if you're talking about the phenomena of peace, the phenomena of love, they're objects that appear in awareness, so they come and go. You see? You can say, well, there's no relationship because they come and go and awareness is always present. And peace and love are just parts of the movie or the film or the dream that appear on the cinema screen. So there's no relationship. But the reality is that when the body-mind realizes that the screen of consciousness is untouched by life, that it's always okay, then it can start to relax. And when it starts to relax, when it starts to feel calm, peace arises. You see? When you're not suffering so much, then love arises. Because it's our natural, these are natural expressions of the human body. You could say it's just an expression of health. A healthy mind, healthy body and mind will feel at peace and will generally feel loving. You will naturally care about other people. But it comes and goes. It comes and goes. The peace, the phenomenal sense of peace and the phenomenal sense of love are not constant. They come and go because they're objects, they're subtle objects that appear within awareness. How do you not push things away when you really want to push them away? What's the answer? That's a really good point, thank you. Well, it's okay to push things away. You see? You don't have to make this into an ideal. The mind will always make these teachings into an ideal. They'll always conceptualize them and say, okay, I've got the answer. The answer is not to push anything away. Oh, damn, I just pushed something away. That's bad person, bad. So, you see, that's what the mind does. Actually, it's okay to push things away. We're not pushing away, right? And it's natural to push things away sometimes. It's not, and in many different ways. Physically, if something's going to cause you harm, you might physically push it away, right? Psychologically, if somebody is invading your psychological space or trespassing your psychological or emotional boundaries, you know, then you might put up, you might say, that's not acceptable that you talk to me like that. That's not acceptable, you treat me like that. That's not acceptable to me. You're asserting an emotional and psychological boundary. That's an important part of being a healthy human being, is knowing what your emotional and psychological boundaries are. Just as it is knowing what your physical boundaries are. Yeah? And we might be scared of something. Maybe we've got a psychological issue of some kind, and we're scared. We don't want to go into it. Maybe we've been traumatized in the past, and we think, you know what, I just don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. It's too scary for me. That's okay. You don't have to go there. Now, eventually you'll have to go there for that trauma to heal. But, you know, maybe that's not now. You know, maybe that's another time. Maybe that's in the future sometime. Maybe that's 5 minutes from now. Maybe it's 5 years from now. It will happen at its own pace. You know, we don't have to force it. That's okay. So pushing things away can be healthy, and we don't have to resist resistance. We don't have to resist pushing things away. We can observe and allow ourselves to feel that urge to push away, you see. You have the urge to push away. You have the urge to push away. You have the urge to force something away. And then you can notice, why do I want to push that away? Well, it feels terrible. I don't want to feel that way. And you can even explore it, maybe. And you can learn from it. It can give you insights. Whereas if you say, I should not push things away, what you're doing there, you've got a conceptual understanding which you're trying to adhere to. And that is the spiritual bypassing, you see? Because you're saying, I must not be like that kind of person. You're forcing yourself into a mold in which you're not fitting into. You just have to force yourself into it. So that's a form of psychological violence. You're committing psychological violence on yourself. For those of you who have read Jiddu Krishnamurti, he used to talk about this as being violence. He said this is like a form of violence to ourselves when we try and force ourselves into something where we don't really fit in there. And what you do, you prevent an intelligence from naturally emerging in which you can learn about yourself, in which you can learn about these aspects, these shadow aspects of yourself, these darker aspects of yourself. And through coming into communion with yourself, you see, communion meaning being open to and allowing the negative stuff, not acting out on it necessarily, not being destructive, but on a thought and feeling level, allowing it to arise if it feels right, if you're in a strong enough place to do that. See, sometimes the best thing to do when you've got an addictive tendency is just to quash it, just to push it away, because that's the best way to deal with it. But when it's less strong, then you can face it and you can allow it to arise up in you. You can understand it, you can observe it, and you can let it go away. But if it's too traumatizing or it's too strong and overpowering, then maybe you need to push it away for a bit. That's okay. Find what works for you. Learn about it. Don't have any dogmatic ideals. Take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt. And if it works for you, that's it. Good for you. And if you find something else, then tell me. I'd love to learn. So I don't have all the answers. Freedom doesn't mean you have all the answers. So freedom just means that you realize freedom. It doesn't mean you know about politics. It doesn't mean you know about science. It doesn't mean you know about psychic stuff. It doesn't mean you've sorted all your issues out. But it makes life a lot easier. At least that's my experience. It's very easy to get very conceptual about these teachings and to fall into a particular way of talking or thinking about the teachings. And that's fine. If you find a way that works for you, then stick with it. But just realize it's so open, it's so vast. This is why things like inquiry and exploration, quite scientific inquiry, can go hand in hand with faith and devotion and images of Indian gods and things like this, and quite esoteric things like chakras and nadis and all this kind of stuff. So all this stuff can actually go together. It's wonderful, I think, the different ways it can be expressed. I would suggest following your heart, finding a practice that either lifts you up if that's what you need, finding a practice that settles you down if that's what you need, noticing, looking for the sense of me, the sense of self, and getting to know that sense of self, and then noticing that it's an object, that it's not you, the subject. And just continuing that practice, that can be really powerful. You can almost tell how powerful a practice or a teaching is, or how widespread it is in different traditions. That practice you find everywhere. If you're somebody who's quite into your thoughts and your mind, I'd really recommend some kind of more emotional type practice that can open you up to feelings. And if you are someone who's very much stuck in your mind, or in your thoughts, you'll feel stupid when you first do it. It'll feel wrong. It won't feel right because you're not used to it. But try it. Try praying. I think prayer is a wonderful practice on many different levels. Try talking to God. Yes, it will feel strange. You might feel like an idiot, but try it. Try devotion. Try chanting. Try gratitude. Try singing. Be open to what life gives you. The ultimate teacher, that is life, or God, the Sadguru, true Guru, life, that brings us all here, brings us all together, teaches us everything we need. It purifies us. Life gives us wisdom. We can give life gratitude. We can give thanks to God.